In Westfield, New Jersey, behind the stately doors of a luxurious mansion, a shocking secret lay dormant. John List, a devout father and husband, led what appeared to be the ideal suburban life with his wife Helen, their 3 children, and his elderly mother. Yet, beneath this perfect image, a brewing turmoil was about to spiral into a dark abyss from which there was no return. In November 1971, the unimaginable happened. The entire List family was brutally murdered, and the perpetrator vanished into thin air, leaving behind a mystery that would baffle authorities for nearly 2 decades. What was the real motive behind this horrifying act? And how did an ordinary man mastermind one of the most infamous disappearances in American history? To understand the tragedy of Breeze Knoll, we must journey back to the origins of its central figure, John List. Born in 1925 in Bay City, Michigan, to German-American parents, John's upbringing was steeped in a strict Lutheran faith, a doctrine that would dictate much of his life's path. John grew in the shadow of a domineering father and the weight of religious expectation. His home life was devoid of warmth and affection, replaced instead with rigid discipline and the demand for perfection. Seeking escape and perhaps a sense of purpose, List served as a laboratory technician in the Army during World War II. In 1944, his father died. After List was discharged in 1946, his return to civilian life saw him armed with a degree in accounting, a profession that prized the order and control he had long been conditioned to uphold. In 1950, he re-enlisted to fight in the Korean War. At Fort Eustis in Virginia, he met 24-year-old Helen Morris Taylor, a widow with a daughter, Brenda. Her husband was killed in action in Korea. Helen became the first woman of 26-year-old List. In 1951, John married her. The union, blessed under the eyes of God, was expected to be the foundation of John's ideal family. But beneath the surface, cracks began to form, revealing the dark side of the American dream. Helen's battle with alcoholism and a diagnosis of tertiary syphilis, a secret she kept from John until after their marriage, planted seeds of betrayal and resentment. This disease made her nearly blind. Helen's disability prevented her from walking, and she mostly stayed in bed. The couple had 3 children together, Patricia, John Jr., and Frederick. In 1960, List's stepdaughter Brenda got married and left their house. John was vice president and controller in a bank, and also Sunday school teacher at the local church. The family never missed a service. To the outside world, they were a picture-perfect family. Yet, John's inability to reconcile the imperfections of his family life with the unattainable standards set by his faith and upbringing foreshadowed a silent storm brewing on the horizon. 1965 marked a turning point for the Lists as they moved into Breeze Knoll, a 19-room Victorian mansion with marble fireplaces and a Tiffany skylight in Westfield, New Jersey. It was a grand statement, but its upkeep put a strain on John's finances, further exacerbating the pressure he felt to provide and maintain the facade of success. It was the most expensive house in Westfield at the time, and the family could not fully furnish it. List's neighbors said he was cold and reserved. Sometimes they saw John mowing his lawn in a full suit and tie. His marriage was probably unhappy. The family's Lutheran pastor overheard Helen saying to John, "If you were half the man my first husband was, we wouldn't be having the troubles we're having." John's professional life was marked by frequent changes and failures, a stark contrast to the image of stability he desperately sought to project. In 1971, at the age of 46, John List lost his position at the bank. The job loss was a personal humiliation, a failure not only as a provider but as a man worthy of respect and admiration. His efforts to find another employment were unsuccessful. The thought of informing his family about the loss of income seemed unbearable. He dressed for work every morning and spent his days at the train station, reading newspapers, and covertly withdrew funds from his mother's bank accounts to cover the mortgage. List declined to seek welfare assistance, fearing the humiliating shame it would bring upon him in the community and contravening the values of self-reliance instilled in him by his father. The psychological portrait of John List that emerges is one of a man at war with himself, torn between the dogmatic beliefs of his upbringing and the realities of his faltering life. John was walking a tightrope of his own making. The chasm between the ideal and the real was widening, pushing him to the brink. As winter's chill enveloped the town of Westfield, a shroud of mystery began to unfurl around the stately List mansion. What lay within its walls was a secret so dark it would chill the bones of a community. Days turned to weeks since anyone had seen John List or his family. Neighbors grew concerned, lights in the mansion burned day and night, yet its inhabitants seemed to have vanished into thin air. The once meticulous lawn now lay unkempt, a silent testament to the abnormality of the situation. Finally, light bulbs started burning out one by one. December 7, 1971, marked the day the silence was broken. Police, responding to concerned calls, entered Breeze Knoll. Nothing could have prepared them for the scene that awaited. Organ church music was playing in the cold house as the heating had been turned off. In the mansion's ballroom, the lifeless bodies of the List family were found, each meticulously laid out. John's wife, Helen, their 3 children, Patricia, John Jr., Frederick, and his mother, Alma, had all been shot. It was a methodical execution, a chillingly orchestrated end to a family. On November 9, 1971, List dropped the children off at school. He returned home around 9 a.m. and got 2 old handguns from his garage. While his children were at school, he entered the kitchen where his 47-year-old wife, Helen, was having toast and sipping her morning coffee. He shot her in the back of her head. Then he went upstairs to his 84-year-old mother's room on the 3rd floor. She was making toast. Greeting him with a kiss, she asked him about the loud noise. List said he didn't know and shot her in the face. "Like Judas, I gave her a kiss," he remarked later. Then he dragged his wife's body to the ballroom, mopped the floor in the kitchen, and ate a sandwich waiting for his children. In his memoir, List wrote that he had to mop the floor 3 or 4 times, and because they had no mop wringer, he had to wring it by hand. He confessed that he experienced no qualms or feelings of remorse. His 16-year-old daughter, Patricia, and 13-year-old son, Frederick, arrived home from school. List shot each of them in the back of the head. "I approached all of them from behind so they wouldn't realize at the last moment what I was going to do to them," he said later. "After it was all over, I said some prayers for them all, from the hymn book. That was the least that I could do." He said he had to kill his mother because the other deaths would have been a tremendous shock to her. After that, List had lunch and drove to the post office, and then to his bank to close both his and his mother's bank accounts. Later, he drove to Westfield High School to watch his 15-year-old son, John, play in a soccer game. He drove him home where he shot him 10 times. Evidence of a misfire indicated that his son tried to defend himself. He also didn't die at once, hence List shot multiple times. "I didn't want him to suffer," he said later. He sent notes to the children's schools and part-time jobs saying that the children would be visiting their ill grandmother in North Carolina for a few weeks. Milk, mail, and newspaper deliveries were stopped by him. List arranged the bodies of his wife and children on sleeping bags in the mansion's ballroom. Their faces were covered with rags. His mother's body was left in her converted apartment in the attic. List slept in the house where his family lay dead, then left the next morning. Before leaving, he tuned a radio to a religious station, leaving religious hymns playing in the empty rooms of the house. He explained that the music over the intercom was supposed to deter burglars. When the police discovered the bodies, John List was nowhere to be found. The man who sought control above all had orchestrated his family's demise before vanishing, leaving behind only a haunting letter that attempted to justify the unjustifiable. It was a 5-page letter to his pastor. List's letter speaks volumes. It reveals a man who saw himself as a failure, unable to fulfill the roles society and his faith demanded of him. In his mind, murdering his family was a twisted salvation from financial ruin and the moral decay he perceived. In his letter, he said, "As I was doing it, I knew it was wrong. But as he was broke, he didn't want to subject his children to poverty and the shame of losing their mansion. He also said he saw too much evil in the world, and he had killed his family to save their souls. He was afraid that his family, confronted with a world full of evil and poverty, would turn from God. To his mind, this was the only way to ensure their safe arrival in heaven. He said, "I finally decided that the only way to save them from that was to kill them." He wrote that his family was turning away from God and would ultimately spend eternity in hell for their sins because his wife Helen had stopped going to church. Moreover, his teenage daughter Patty desired to become an actress. I'm sure many will say, how can anyone do such a horrible thing? My only answer is it isn't easy and was only done after much thought. At the end of the letter, he wrote, "Mother is in the hallway in the attic, 3rd floor. She was too heavy to move." List's letter offered a window into a fractured mind. His actions suggested a delusional belief system. His need for control and perfection, coupled with deep religious convictions, warped into a justification for his unfathomable choice. The discovery of the List murders sent shockwaves through Westfield. One of the first officers who saw the bodies, Robert Kenny, said, "After 28 years as a police officer and 14 as an investigator, you see everything. But this was unique." The mystery of John List's disappearance would confound authorities for nearly 2 decades. But as the manhunt stretched on, the legend of John List grew, a ghostly figure who had slipped through the cracks of a society he could no longer face. With the grim discovery inside Breeze Knoll, the quiet town of Westfield found itself at the epicenter of a horrifying mystery. The investigation into the List family murders unfolded like a puzzle missing crucial pieces. Each room of the mansion told a part of the story, but the narrator of this tragic tale was conspicuously absent. As the manhunt for John List began, investigators faced the daunting task of tracking a man who seemed to have evaporated. Meanwhile, the public grappled with the duality of a devout churchgoer and a cold-blooded killer. List had planned his escape meticulously, cleaning the crime scenes, cutting himself out of every family photo with scissors, severing ties, and leaving no trace. He burned the photos along with his passport in his Weber grill. In an era before digital footprints, List vanished into the ether. The FBI found his car parked at Kennedy International Airport in New York, but there was no trace of him. The police investigated hundreds of leads without success. In August 1972, 9 months after the murder, Breeze Knoll stood empty until it was mysteriously destroyed by fire. There were rumors that the house was cursed. Despite being officially deemed arson, no suspects have been identified. The fire also consumed the mansion's ballroom stained glass skylight, believed to be a signed Tiffany original and valued at around $100,000 at that time, which would be approximately $700,000 today. Selling the ceiling would have allowed List to pay off his debts. By 1974, a new house had been constructed on the property. The absence of technology in 1970s was a cloak of invisibility for List. His identity was erased. For List, it was a desperate bid for survival. A twisted form of self-preservation that made him abandon his name, his history, and his crimes. Assuming the name Robert Peter Clark, List started anew in Denver, Colorado. Here, he melded into the fabric of society, unnoticed. For List, integrating into a new life was simpler in a city like Denver, which during the 1970s saw a significant number of people relocating from the East Coast. He grew a mustache, swapped his suits for casual clothes, and took to wearing a cap, yet made no significant effort to alter his appearance further. He first worked as a chef at a Holiday Inn, and between 1979 and 1986, he worked as the controller for a paper box manufacturing company located just outside Denver. Adopting a new identity allowed List to compartmentalize his guilt and live outwardly as a regular citizen. Yet, beneath the surface, the burden of his past life lingered, a specter only he could see. List's new life was a mirror of the old, minus the family he had destroyed. He worked in accounting, remarried, and maintained a facade of devout faith. He became a member of a Lutheran church and organized a carpool for congregants without transport. At a church event, he encountered 35-year-old divorcee Dolores Miller, an Army PX clerk, and they married in 1985. He told her his first wife had died of cancer and moved into her apartment in Aurora, Colorado, situated 10 miles east of Denver. In February 1988, the couple moved to a house in the Brander Mill neighborhood of Midlothian, Virginia. There, List continued his career in accounting at a small firm. For nearly 2 decades, John List, now Bob Clark, believed he had outsmarted the world and committed the perfect crime. He let his guard down, losing his mustache. But as the 18th anniversary of the murders approached, a television show was about to shatter his illusion of freedom. On May 21, 1989, a pivotal episode of America's Most Wanted aired, turning the tide in one of the most baffling manhunts in American history. The decision to feature List on the show was a gamble. With few leads and fading memories, the case had grown cold. But America's Most Wanted had a secret weapon, an age-progressed clay sculpture of List, crafted by forensic artist Frank Bender. Psychologists speculated that List might wear spectacles similar to those he wore in his youth, as a reminder of more successful days. Bender's creation was eerily prescient. He envisioned List with glasses and a receding hairline, a testament to the power of forensic artistry. An audience of 22 million saw the sculpture. When the episode aired, the phone lines lit up. On that evening, a man known as Robert Clark was present at a church event in Midlothian, Virginia. Meanwhile, several of his acquaintances were at their homes, contacting the hotline established by America's Most Wanted. They identified their reserved friend and neighbor as the individual who had horrifically murdered his family years earlier. At the same time, people from Golden, Colorado, were reaching out to the same hotline, asserting that John List and Robert Clark, the local French fry cook who had recently moved to Virginia, were indeed the same person. An old friend of Dolores recognized the man on TV and also made a call. One tip came from List's next-door neighbor. According to her, the resemblance was striking. She said her neighbor was also an accountant and attended church. The viewer's tips led authorities to Virginia. The confrontation was the culmination of years of evasion, a moment when List's meticulously constructed world came crashing down. FBI agents knocked on the door of the shared home of Dolores and Robert Clark. Dolores answered, but her husband was at work. She showed them two photos, one from their wedding day, which were the spitting image of the bust. One officer stayed with her while the other rushed to List's accounting firm where he was apprehended. The arrest of List, who had been a pillar of respectability to the outside world, was a shock. FBI agent Kevin August said, "He was a strange man, I would say. He was not very animated. That's the best way to put it. He seemed to me as a vessel, with no soul in there." When driving List to the police station, August asked, "What kind of man are you, that you killed your mother, your wife, and your children, and then assumed another identity and married another woman who has no idea who you are?" List said nothing, but a single tear rolled down his eye. List maintained his assumed identity for months after being extradited back to Union County, New Jersey, in 1989. However, on February 16, 1990, when confronted with undeniable proof, including fingerprints matching those in his military records and crime scene evidence, he admitted to his real identity. In custody, List confessed to the murders, citing financial ruin and a twisted belief that killing his family was a merciful act, sparing them the shame of poverty. But there were deeper issues at play: List's need for control, his rigid moralism, and his inability to face failure. His actions, though unfathomable, were a twisted solution to an unsolvable problem in his mind. Expert psychologists also believed that List was going through a midlife crisis. The prosecution pointed out that was no excuse for killing 5 innocent people. A court-appointed psychiatrist determined that List suffered from obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, believing his only options were either to accept welfare, which he deemed unacceptable due to the potential for public ridicule, and the contradiction of his father's principles regarding the care and protection of family members, or to kill his family, ensuring their ascent to heaven. Alan Goldstein, who examined List for the defense, said, "It wasn't as if he didn't have a conscience. If anything, his conscience was too bright. He felt responsible for saving souls." His wife couldn't believe that List was a mass murderer. She said, "I love my husband very deeply. I cannot believe this is the same man." Later, List confessed to his wife, sobbing and saying to her, "I was always such a kind, gentle man, except for that one act." John List's capture closed a long-standing chapter of mystery and horror, but it also opened a window into the mind of a killer, revealing the dark corners where rationality warps into madness. The trial of John List unfolded in a Union County courthouse. Defense lawyers depicted List as someone deeply affected by a religious upbringing enforced by his parents, which, they argued, drove him to madness. However, the jury was unconvinced. Throughout the trial, the emotionless tone of List's letters, his clearly planned escape strategies, and his lack of remorse, maintaining he acted as the savior rather than the murderer of his family, resulted in his conviction. During his trial, List testified that his financial difficulties reached crisis level in 1971, following his job loss due to the shutdown of the Jersey City Bank. To hide this embarrassing fact from his family, he maintained his usual routines. Over time, the family's financial situation became worse, leading List to encourage his children to find part-time work under the guise of teaching them responsibility, though it was actually a strategy to aid the family's finances. Furthermore, he struggled with his wife Helen's alcohol dependency and her undisclosed tertiary syphilis, which she had hidden for 18 years after contracting it from her first husband. Helen had manipulated List into marrying her by falsely claiming pregnancy, then insisted on a Maryland wedding to avoid states that required syphilis testing before marriage. At the time, a premarital syphilis test was mandated in most other states. Her condition deteriorated over the years. She didn't say anything about that to List, but a thorough examination revealed the condition in 1969. Eventually, her disease, together with her excessive drinking, transformed her into an unkempt and paranoid recluse who would often humiliate List in public, comparing him unfavorably to her first husband in bed. John List's actions were a cataclysmic culmination of years of internal and external pressures. Financial despair, a crumbling facade of familial perfection, and a rigid, punitive religious upbringing coalesced into a devastating breakdown of his moral and psychological boundaries. Witness after witness painted a portrait of a man at odds with reality. Yet, it was List's own letters and the chilling confession tape played for the jury that offered the most haunting insights into his psyche. In his confession, List spoke with a chilling calmness, claiming financial ruin and a misguided attempt to save his family's souls as his motives. But beneath this veneer of rationalization lurked deeper, darker struggles. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Guilty on all counts. On April 12, 1990, List was found guilty on 5 counts of first-degree murder. During his sentencing hearing, he refused to fully accept blame, stating, "I feel that because of my mental state at the time, I was unaccountable for what happened. I ask all affected by this for their forgiveness, understanding, and prayer." However, the judge firmly disagreed, declaring, "John List is without remorse and without honor," he said. After 18 years, 5 months, and 22 days, it is now time for the voices of Helen, Alma, Patricia, Frederick, and John List to rise from the grave. List received the maximum sentence allowed then, 5 consecutive life terms. List appealed his conviction, citing post-traumatic stress disorder from his military experience as impairing his judgment and claiming the letter found at the crime scene, which was essentially a confession, should be considered a confidential message to his pastor and not admissible in court. These appeals were dismissed by a federal appeals court. Years later, List admitted some regret for his actions in a 2002 interview with Connie Chung, saying, "I wish I had never done what I did. I've regretted my action and prayed for forgiveness ever since." Regarding why he didn't take his own life, he believed it would have prevented him from going to heaven, where he hoped to be reunited with his family. "So eventually I got to the point where I felt that I could kill them. Hopefully, they would go to heaven, and then maybe I would have a chance to later confess my sins to God and get forgiveness." He also said, "When we get to heaven, they'll either have forgiven me or won't realize what had happened. I'm sure that if we recognize each other, we'll like each other's company just like we did here when times were better." List passed away at the age of 82 from pneumonia complications on March 21, 2008, in prison at St. Francis Medical Center in Trenton, New Jersey. John List's case became a cornerstone in the study of family annihilators, offering insights into the mind of a killer who operates under the guise of protector, driven by twisted logic and profound psychological distress. Statistic serial killer Michael Madison. 2 weeks shy of Halloween 1977, Michael Madison was born on October 15th in Cleveland, Ohio. His parents, Diane Madison and John Baldwin, accidentally got pregnant and didn't have much of a relationship at the time of his birth. John Baldwin left Diane to care for their young son and denied being Michael's father. Growing up, Diane's mother had been a sex worker and heroin addict. She grew up in a household full of neglect. Diane's upbringing left her unprepared to care for her young son independently. Shortly after giving birth to her son, Michael, social workers were brought into the home. Diane was allowing her constant stream of boyfriends to punish Michael. When Michael was 2, Diane was found to have forcefully stuffed food down Michael's throat. As a result, the toddler began vomiting uncontrollably. Unsure of what to do, Diane put her screaming son into a tub full of hot water. This caused Michael to cry more. Growing frustrated with her young son, Diane took him out of a bath and beat him with an extension cord. A year later, one of Diane's many boyfriends beat Michael so severely with a belt that the young boy vomited and needed to be hospitalized. In another horrific incident, Michael was beaten so severely by another one of Diane's boyfriends that he lost hearing in one of his ears. After years of abuse, Michael was sent to live with his grandmother, who was still a heroin addict and sex worker. But unfortunately, Michael's horrific childhood wouldn't change. Michael continued to be hospitalized for reasons such as dehydration. The social workers involved in Michael's case would note that he and his half-brother were covered in scratches and bruises. Before Michael reached high school, he had become a familiar face to law enforcement. On several occasions, the teenager had been found using lemon. In high school, he received a delinquent charge for inappropriately touching another classmate. The crimes Michael committed as a teenager were nothing like the ones he would go on to commit as an adult. In July 2013, the family of 38-year-old Angela Deskins reported her missing after they hadn't heard from her since June. Deskins was known for disappearing from time to time, so the family didn't think much of it. A month after she went missing, her body was discovered wrapped in electrical cords with a belt around her neck. 28-year-old Shadisha Sheely was reported missing in September 2012 when she didn't show up at her mother's house. Sheely, along with her 12-year-old daughter, were living with extended family at the time, and Sheely was supposed to stop by her mother's house to borrow some money, but she never showed. Her body was found in July 2013 inside a plastic garbage bag. After returning home from her job at an elementary school, 18-year-old Sherelda Terry disappeared. Her body was also found inside a black trash bag. On July 19, 2013, Michael's neighbors called the police to report a horrible smell coming from a garage near his second-floor apartment building. Inside the garage, the police discovered the decomposing body of a woman. During the police search of the surrounding area, including other vacant homes and backyards, the police found the bodies of 2 more women. Each was wrapped in plastic bags and located approximately 200 yards apart. The police were granted a search warrant for Michael's home, and inside they found further evidence of decomposition. Now the search was on to find where Michael Madison was. The police tracked him down to his mother's house. When they arrived, Michael refused to come out, resulting in a several-hour-long standoff between him and the police before he finally agreed to come out and was taken into police custody. Michael never once showed remorse to the victims' families during the trial. Michael laughed, smiled, and 20 the families. During Sherelda Terry's father's victim impact statement, Michael smiled at the distraught father. This set Terry's father off, and he tried to attack Michael but was quickly stopped. Michael didn't stop smiling once during the altercation. The jury deliberated less than a day before Michael Madison was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was also found guilty of 3 counts of kidnapping, 3 counts of gross abuse of a corpse, 1 count of rape, and 1 count of weapons possession by an ex-convict. On May 20, 2016, Michael was sentenced to death, a sentence he would attempt to appeal a month later. On July 21, 2020, the Ohio Supreme Court voted unanimously to uphold the death sentence for Michael Madison. Killer Ronald O'Brien. Children are cautioned from an early age not to accept candy from strangers. While this golden rule is strictly enforced by vigilant parents throughout the year, on Halloween night, they throw caution to the wind and allow their little ones to go door to door asking for treats. In most instances, their request is granted without worry. Even so, once in a while, the monsters that lurk in the shadows take advantage of the occasion, resulting in dire consequences for the most innocent among us. In 1974, a boy in Pasadena, Texas fell victim to just such a predator when he became violently ill after indulging in a treat from his Halloween bag. Ever the concerned parent, his father had stayed by his side during the hour-long ordeal, offering comfort to the youngster as he convulsed on the bathroom floor. Only 8 years old at the time, Timothy O'Brien died later that night on his way to the hospital. In a shocking turn of events, an autopsy revealed that he had ingested enough potassium cyanide to kill 2 grown men. As difficult as it was to believe, all signs pointed to the fact that someone had deliberately laced candy with a colorless compound before randomly handing it out to unsuspecting children. Investigators were convinced that a cold-blooded killer was hiding somewhere in the suburbs of Houston, and they intended to find him. With no suspects in mind and little evidence to go on, detectives theorized that an unscrupulous person who was angry at the world in general had decided to take the life of a complete stranger, a child no less, as a way of getting back at society. To make a difficult situation even worse, there was no telling how many children had received the tainted sweets. Although authorities had put out an emergency news bulletin requesting that all Halloween candy be brought to the police station for inspection, they feared that there would be other victims before all was said and done. While they faced an uphill battle, to be sure, investigators did have a few things working in their favor. For one, it had been raining heavily on the evening of Trick or Treat, which had limited the number of houses that Timothy and his sister Elizabeth had visited. More importantly, a chemical analysis of the contents of the boys' treat bag had enabled them to pinpoint the carrier of the poison. Lab tests revealed that the killer's lethal weapon of choice had been the sweet and sour powder contained inside of a straw-shaped pixie sticks. After meeting with the residents of the houses where the O'Brien children were known to have gotten candy, detectives were confident that none of them had given out pixie sticks. However, during the course of their interviews, they learned that someone had been witnessed doling out that particular treat and that someone had been Timothy's father, Ronald O'Brien. When he was brought in for questioning, O'Brien claimed that a man he had never seen before had emerged from a darkened home and given him several pixie sticks to hand out on his behalf. He added that, after consuming a small amount of the sugary powder, Timothy had complained that it tasted funny. Instead of telling him to throw it out, he had given his son a soft drink to help wash it down. Under the pretense of helping police solve the case, he had readily provided them with the address of the house where the exchange had taken place. Upon speaking with the mystery man, who turned out to be an air traffic controller named Claudine Melvin, officers learned that he had an alibi for the night in question. According to him, he had been at work and had not returned home until well after midnight. When they visited his place of employment, his supervisor confirmed his story and had the paperwork to prove it. In a stunning show of support, 200 of Melvin's coworkers came forward to vouch for his character. Realizing that they had been duped, investigators quickly concluded that this man was not their killer, something that Ronald O'Brien had known all along. A bit of digging into his past uncovered that Ronald O'Brien, who had trained as an optician, was not nearly as respectable as he wanted others to believe. I'm not content who couldn't hold a job, he was drowning in a sea of debt. Not above taking what he wanted, he had been accused of stealing on numerous occasions, usually by former employers. While being shiftless and prone to theft doesn't necessarily mean that someone is capable of murder, the fact that O'Brien had taken out hefty life insurance policies, not one but 3, on his children in the months prior to his son's untimely death moved him to the top of the list of suspects. Another nail in O'Brien's self-constructed coffin came when it was discovered that he had phoned the insurance company on the morning after his son's death, inquiring about a payout. As the 8-year-old's body lay in the icy morgue, his father's only concern had been how quickly the money he had coming would change hands. On November 5, 1974, less than a week after Timothy was poisoned, Ronald O'Brien was taken into custody and formally charged with 1 count of murder and 4 counts of attempted murder. To no one's surprise, he pleaded not guilty across the board. He would steadfastly maintain his innocence throughout the trial, despite the damning evidence against him. During the proceedings, a parade of witnesses testified that O'Brien had become fixated on the properties of cyanide in the months leading up to his son's murder. His obsession led him to brazenly ask friends and family alike if they knew where he could purchase the deadly poison. He would also inquire of them if they had any idea how much of the substance it would take to kill a person. In June of 1975, 8 months after little Timothy O'Brien had been laid to rest, his father was convicted of his murder. He was also found guilty in the attempted poisonings of the other 4 children, none of whom had ingested the lethal powder. For his crimes, Ronald O'Brien, whom the press had dubbed the Candyman, was condemned to the electric chair. Down the road, as alternative methods of execution were introduced, his punishment was amended to a more humane death by lethal injection. It had taken the jury just over an hour to decide the fate of the man who had so callously plotted and carried out the murder of someone who had trusted him implicitly. Once the verdict was in, the waiting game began. As it happened, 9 years would pass, more time than Timothy had spent on this earth before his killer would face final justice. During his time on death row, O'Brien was reviled by his fellow inmates who, despite their own misdeeds, considered him to be lower than a snake's belly. Their hatred of the child killer ran so deep that they had thrown a party on the day of his demise to let him know that he would not be missed. After several stays of execution, O'Brien was put to death on March 31st, 1984, at the age of 39. When asked if he had any last words, he had taken the opportunity to rail against the system that had allowed him to come to such an end. When his death was announced over the loudspeaker, hundreds of people who had gathered outside the prison to celebrate the occasion had shouted trick or treat while throwing handfuls of candy in the air in remembrance of Timothy, a young boy who had paid the ultimate price for his father's greed. Todd Allen Reed, the Forest Park killer. The bodies of 3 women were found in the same stretch of parkland, all within a month of each other. It was not long before police had their man. But is he responsible for more than the 3 murders they convicted him for? 32-year-old Todd Allen Reed was already a registered sex offender when he strangled to death at least 3 women before dunking their naked bodies in Forest Park, a heavily wooded area just west of Portland, Oregon. From 1992 to 1995, he had served a measly 2.5 years of a 12-year sentence for the sexual assault of Shelley Harding, who was 7 months pregnant at the time of his cowardly attack. She had been walking home from work when he approached her and forced her into his car at knife point. Reed was involved in and fled the scene of a minor crash with another vehicle on his way to the secluded spot where he sexually assaulted Shelley. After he had assaulted her, he attempted to strangle her with a seatbelt and began to cry. Shelley was strong and she was calm. She had been talking to Reed constantly, like he was a friend almost, building a rapport. Whilst doing so, she made sure to leave as much physical evidence as she could, touching every surface to leave as many of her prints as possible. Whatever this monster was going to do to her, she wasn't going to make it easy for him to get away with. When Reed broke down, she used this to her advantage, and her pleas to be let go and her promises that she would not tell anyone worked. Reed let her go. Not only did Shelley report her abduction and assault, the 2 men that had been in the car that Reed had crashed into also reported the hit and run. They even had his license plate. Reed pleaded no contest and was handed the 12-year sentence. He was registered as a sex offender and, crucially, his DNA was taken and stored in the state crime lab. This would be the golden ticket police needed to catch the Forest Park serial killer 7 years later. Reed was released early as he had built up sentence-reducing credits, half of which were for good behavior. At roughly 8 miles long and 5,100 acres, Forest Park is one of the largest urban forest reserves in the USA, ranked 19th to be more precise. It is not easy to wander from the 70 miles of trails due to the park's dense vegetation. To highlight just how secluded this park can get once you're off trail, in 2004, a 53-year-old man called Frank and his 12-year-old daughter Ruth were discovered to be living off-grid in the park. They had been there for 4 years, completely undetected. On May 7, 1999, a couple walking their dog on one of the park's more remote trails would come across the body of 28-year-old Willa Faye Mahler. She was naked and face down, entangled in thick blackberry brambles. She had been strangled, and it was determined that her body had been there for around 2 months. Police would find a used condom merely 28 feet from her body. They were able to extract DNA from this vital piece of evidence. The next day, May 8th, police themselves would discover a second body whilst they were searching the immediate area. The body of 26-year-old Stephanie Lynn Muscle was found around a quarter of a mile away from where Lilla had been discovered. She too was found naked and had been strangled. Tests would determine she had been left there less than a week before she was found. They would also recover traces of DNA on her thighs. A group of hikers would find the third body, that of 18-year-old Alexandria Eisen, in the early evening of June 2nd. Alexandria had been reported missing sometime in May. Police were unable to reach her body until the next day due to the location. She'd been dumped down an extremely steep slope just off of a deer path. She was found naked, and she too had been strangled. Her body was around 1/4 of a mile away from Lila and Stephanie's. After the discovery of Alexandria's body, Police Chief Charles Moves admitted that investigators had concluded they were looking for a serial killer due to the similarities of the crimes. Physically, all three women resembled each other, but they also had very similar life experiences. They were all homeless at the time of their deaths and had cocaine and heroin addictions, although Stephanie had just completed a detox program before her murder. Lila and Alexandria had been at some point engaged in prostitution to pay for these addictions. All three women were known to frequent West Burnside Street. It's also been claimed that Lila and Stephanie knew each other, although this has not been proven either way. It was determined that all three of the women had been murdered elsewhere and their bodies were taken to Forest Park afterwards. Toxicology all showed that they had taken heroin sometime before their deaths. The police response was immediate and it was impressive. A specialist task force consisting of 16 individuals was formed, and they set about scouting bars, reaching out and offering protection to the community being targeted, and 30 additional beds were made available for homeless women during the investigation. Although residents were not happy about the lack of information they were receiving, the police kept their investigation tightly under wraps. Such was their determination to catch this killer. The task force would use the physical similarities of the three women to their advantage. A female officer of a similar appearance posed as a prostitute on West Burnside Street to see if they could reel the killer in. And sure enough, Reed took the bait. On the July 7th, the same day a vigil was being held for Lila, Stephanie, and Alexandria, Reed approached the undercover officer, and it was not long before his suspicious behavior flagged him to police. At about 5:20 a.m., he was approached by a member of the lookout team, Sergeant John Botchelet. Reed readily admitted that he was a sex offender and agreed to a search of his vehicle. They found an unused condom, a book entitled A Killing Gift about a woman who can kill men by merely looking at them, and some yellow strapping. There was nothing incriminating to be found, and the police had to let him go. He was not off the hook, however, far from it. Another lookout that night, Detective Sergeant Dave Schlegel, recognized him from the 1992 sexual assault case. He had in fact been the arresting officer. Police began 24-hour surveillance of Reed, both at his home and at his place of work. At least once during this surveillance, he was observed driving in circles around West Burnside and Sandy Boulevard. The police swab results came back and confirmed that the DNA from the condom at the Mower crime scene and the DNA found on Stephanie's thighs matched the DNA that was on file for Todd Allen Reed. At around 7:30 p.m. on July 18th, after Reed had left for work, police executed a search warrant at his address, where he lived with his girlfriend. Once the police had left the premises, his girlfriend phoned him to let him know the police had been there. He attempted to make a getaway in the middle of his shift, but it was too late. The police had already arrived. At 11:30 p.m. on July 18th, 11 days after police had questioned him and only 1.5 months after the task force was set up, Reed was arrested outside of Ranella Produce, the warehouse where he worked night shifts, unloading the delivery trucks. On July 27th, he was indicted on 7 criminal counts in relation to 3 homicides. It emerged that Reed, who had been ordered to serve 8 years post-prison supervision and actually been kicked out of a sex offender treatment program 2 weeks before his arrest for failure to attend. On February 23, 2001, he pleaded guilty and received 3 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. Reed had been facing the death penalty, but his plea deal took this off of the table. Reed is also the prime suspect in 2, possibly 3, other murders in the Portland area. The cases being referred to by Reed are the 1987 cold case murders of 15-year-old Jennifer Lyncher and 12-year-old Mindy Colleen Thomas, and the 1999 disappearance of 19-year-old Amma Signs. In regards to the murders, Gresham Police Sergeant David Lerwick has been quoted as saying, "Always suspect that he was the person who killed both those girls. We didn't have enough evidence to convict him." Jennifer had gone missing on July 3rd, 1987, and her skeletal remains was found on July 8th, 1988. Mingy went missing from the apartment complex where she lived on August 3rd, 1987, and her body was discovered on October 4th, 1988. Both of the children had been strangled and dumped in wooded areas on the eastern side of Gresham, about 3 miles apart, and they were both last seen in the company of Gail Bennett, Reed's then girlfriend and later wife. They married in 1988 and divorced in 1997. Gresham police said Bennett, who has a police record of her own, might have information about the killings but has been uncooperative. Bennett has denied any knowledge. At the time, police were operating under the assumption that they had both been killed by the same man and that this man was known to them. They had questioned Reed at the time of the investigation due to the fact they had both been seen with Gail, but he was never charged or arrested. Police renewed efforts to solve the Gresham cases after his arrest in the Portland killings, but attempts to compare DNA from the old crimes with Reed's DNA have been inconclusive. Amata witnessing on June 30th, 1999 and has not been seen since. She was working as a prostitute at the time of her disappearance, and it has been claimed she knew Slash was friends with Alexandria Eisen. No charges have been brought forward in her case, although it is impossible to downplay the likely and they already had something to do with Amata's disappearance. As of June 2020, what prison Reed is in is not known, and as of June 2021, he was no longer listed as an inmate and may be dead. Perhaps only in movies can women be assassins or hired soldiers. In real life, 8 out of 10 criminals are men, according to statistics. If women do commit violent acts, they usually do so as accomplices or instigators. Alongside the elderly, disabled, and minors, women often appear as victims. They differ from men not only physiologically, but also psychologically. The behavior of the male half of humanity is aggressive and provocative, unlike that of women. Women are more gentle, emotional. They enter a state of hypnosis more easily, are more quickly and strongly affected by anesthetics and psychoactive substances, are more prone to depression, and are more susceptible to deceit and manipulation. A woman is always guided by love, compassion, creation. However, their aspirations are not always shared by the partners they choose for life. This leads to a confrontation of two principles, often destructive for the weaker party in the relationship. Whenever something extraordinary happens, such as a disappearance or a crime against life, the entire city or even the country empathetically follows the developments, especially if the crime is publicized and the potential criminal shows no remorse for their actions. This is a story about another mysterious crime against a young woman that shook Orange Beach, Alabama, USA, on the calendar May 19, 2016. The police chief informed Gary Bardwell, the father of the missing Jessie, of the long-awaited news. "I'm sorry, sir," he began. "Today will be a difficult day for your family. Unfortunately, we do not expect to find your daughter alive, but we know where she might be." A team of detectives along with FBI agents set out for a remote ranch in Farmersville, North Texas. The group arrived in the evening and immediately went searching. In the wooded area, law enforcement officers stumbled upon a piece of metal covering something. There was an unbearable smell of decay nearby. However, those who arrived were prepared not only for this, but also for what caused it. Indeed, on the other side of the shield lay a female body, wrapped in a blue sheet. The corpse was covered with a blanket and 2 red-gold towels with bloodstains. A pile of trash mixed with dirt became the improvised gravestone for the unfortunate. It was clear that the perpetrator was an amateur, as trying to hide the result of their actions, they made it more noticeable. The condition of the body was terrible. After a week under the scorching sun, it had significantly decomposed. Experts needed 7 days to officially identify the victim. For this, dental records of the presumed victim were requested. As the investigation suspected, the discovered body belonged to 27-year-old Jessie Bardwell. The examination showed that the young woman's death was the result of a crime. However, the exact cause could not be determined as the body was too decomposed. Notably, an unknown informant pointed to the location of the woman's remains. Their name was not disclosed until the end. Jessie Bardwell, a beloved daughter and friend, seemingly vanished from the home she shared with her boyfriend named Jason Lowe. Sensing trouble, Gary set off from Mississippi to Texas in search of his child. His instincts were correct. His girl had indeed been in danger for quite some time. But let's start from the beginning. It must be said that the father-daughter relationship was exceptionally strong. Gary recalled being deeply moved at the moment of Jessie's birth. She was so fragile and vulnerable that his heart melted and never belonged to him again. Jessie was born on September 10, 1988, in Pascagoula, Mississippi. Gary and Carla Bardwell were wonderful parents, and besides their daughter, they raised a son named Brandon. The siblings got along well, with the older brother always protecting his little sister from bullies. Grandma Kitty, who adored her grandchildren, was a frequent visitor. She read books to them, shared life stories, and invented various games. In short, they were the quintessential American family. Jessie herself was a joyful, cheerful, and kind girl. She had a unique style that set her apart from her friends. She dreamed of making it in the beauty industry and opening her own salon. When Jessie was 14, the family unit broke down. The Bardwells divorced. When it came time to choose whom to live with, the girl chose her father. Their relationship was warm and trusting. Gary worked as a firefighter, so Jessie often called him to check on him and ensure everything was fine. Over time, the man remarried. However, the stepdaughter and stepmother got along well. Gina was an excellent homemaker and took care of everyone in the household. Jessie understood that her father was happy and not alone with such a woman by his side, which was very important to her, since she would eventually leave the nest. After finishing school, Jessie decided to become independent, so she moved to Orange Beach, Alabama. To support herself, she worked as a waitress at the popular beachfront restaurant Cobalt. Gary remembered how she loved being near the water. It calmed her. Father and daughter kept in constant touch, exchanging messages. When he visited, they would go boating and fishing. Kimberly Esbury, the restaurant manager and Jessie's friend, learned that Jessie's father was a talented musician. Upon retiring, he devoted more time to his passion, honing his skills. As a result, he was often invited to perform at the establishment and even had his own table there. Kimberly later admitted to admiring the relationship between Jessie and her father. They were true friends. Jessie was always present at his performances. The tips she earned went towards college and her dream. At work, she met a young man named Terry Ellis, also a waiter. They started dating after some time. Their relationship was steady and serious. They seemed like a harmonious couple. However, at one of the social events, Jessie was taken by his friend Jason Lowe. Her sudden infatuation surprised everyone. It seemed she was head over heels in love with him, oblivious to everything else around her. After explaining her sudden feelings, Jessie and Terry parted as amicably as they had met. Nonetheless, this decision turned her life upside down by 360 degrees. The new boyfriend was undoubtedly handsome and promising. He had 2 degrees and a decent job. Jason knew how to present himself and was polite. However, for Jessie, the new feelings were also a ticket to a new life. When he heard about his beloved's dreams, he promised to fulfill them. Eventually, the young man needed to transfer to Dallas, Texas. Then, Jessie followed him. The new position in the technology industry promised Jason a high-paying job. Kimberly shared that Jessie saw the move more as an adventure than something that could fundamentally change her life. She certainly didn't want to part with her father for long and hesitated for a while. However, ambition and youthful idealism prevailed. She did all this in secret from Gary. She was very afraid of disappointing her father, knowing he would be against it. Therefore, she didn't tell him even when they spent their last Christmas together. Mr. Bardwell noticed nothing unusual in his daughter's behavior. She was as happy as usual, laughing and joking. So, the 24-year-old found herself in Richardson, a suburb of Dallas. Jason worked from home, while Jessie searched for a new job and scouted locations for her salon. The couple planned to marry and buy a house. However, Jessie's relationship with her father underwent a drastic change. They grew distant. The daughter stopped answering his calls. Mr. Bardwell was troubled by this uncharacteristic behavior. After speaking with Kimberly, he learned about Jessie's new boyfriend and her move to another state. Ultimately, the man accepted the news and tried to re-establish contact. That's when he discovered that Jason controlled all communications. The only way to speak with Jessie was to call her boyfriend or the home phone. After each attempt, Jason would say she'd call back. Eventually, Jessie did indeed get in touch with her father. Months later, Gary finally met the suspicious young man in person when the couple visited Pascagoula. The father tried to convince his daughter not to return to Texas. He had a strong dislike for Lowe. That time, Jessie hugged him tighter than usual. When Gary asked if everything was okay, she said it was fine. She expressed her desire to make them proud, hence her need to leave. Persuading Jessie otherwise was impossible. Despite never showing signs of distress, her father had a bad feeling. After meeting with her, he wrote a song titled "Taken," dedicated to his daughter. 4 months after moving to Texas, she stopped responding to calls altogether. The final straw came on May 8th, when she failed to wish her mother and stepmother a happy Mother's Day, uncharacteristic of her. Gary sensed something terrible had happened, especially since she missed such a cherished family holiday. He called Jason, who claimed he didn't know Jessie's whereabouts. The boyfriend mentioned they were in an open relationship, allowing her to come and go as she pleased. Gary knew this to be false. Jason contradicted himself. He was very jealous and controlled every move. The next morning, the father headed to Texas, convinced of the boyfriend's involvement in his daughter's disappearance. En route, he messaged Lowe, "If Jessie isn't home when I arrive, you're in big trouble." Upon reaching their apartment, he found no trace of his daughter or her belongings. Yet, the boyfriend persisted he was unaware of her location and awaited her return. Later, Kimberly shared details Jessie confided during their rare heart-to-heart conversations. Apparently, Jason squandered money on prohibited substances and entertainment. His promises to fulfill the girl's dream evaporated. Largely, the boyfriend pretended to be someone he wasn't. This extended to his treatment of Jessie. Publicly, their relationship appeared one way, but in private, Jason could be rude and aggressive, leading to frequent conflicts between them. With Jessie missing from the house, Gary filed a missing person report with the Richardson police. Detective Hiram Hale, a father of 3 daughters, led the investigation into her disappearance. The man was determined to uncover the truth. Law enforcement officials acted immediately. They spoke with Lowe several times and inspected the house, but found no trace of the missing woman. During the conversation, the young man mentioned that he last saw her on May 8th around 10 a.m., leaving without explanation, possibly to visit her parents. He saw her get into her Acura car and drive away. Jason kept insisting that despite strong feelings, their relationship was non-committal. He claimed he didn't control her or pry into her personal life. However, investigators received information contradicting his statements. It turned out Jessie had sold her car 3 weeks earlier, a fact he surely knew since he was present at the sale. This raised questions for the investigators, prompting them to interrogate him again. On May 12th, during a subsequent search of his home, police found a strip of powder on a plate in the kitchen. The substance turned out to be cocaine. The investigation then focused on Lowe's garage and the vehicle inside it. Initially resistant, citing the garage was shared and needed others' permission for a search, Lowe eventually ceased his objections. Upon entering, officers immediately noticed a smell characteristic of crime. Jason Lowe's Audi was mud-splattered, and its bumper was detached. Police suspected that Jessie Bardwell might be inside the car. Although the vehicle was empty, the smell of decomposition intensified. Inside, they found the broken bumper and what appeared to be bloodstains in the trunk. When experts sprayed a luminol-based substance, the cargo area lit up with blue light. Blood. presumably belonging to the missing woman. Jason explained he got stuck in the mud while searching for his girlfriend, catching the bumper on a bush. He remained adamant about not knowing her whereabouts. He could not explain the blood in the car or the presence of controlled substances in his home. Experts concluded the amount of blood in the trunk indicated the woman was deceased. Given the circumstances, the case was reclassified as a homicide. To prevent the main suspect from fleeing, he was detained on charges related to the narcotic substances. During interrogation, Lowe persisted in his narrative. When shown a photo of his loved one, he refused to provide explanations, looking emotionlessly at the picture and suggesting he was being framed for something he didn't do. Eventually, despite the absence of a body, the suspect was charged with homicide. As the search for the young woman continued, a challenging and lengthy process in the vastness of Texas, with its many rivers, lakes, fields, and forests, where a body could easily be concealed, her family, friends, and sympathetic acquaintances held a memorial service. The event took place on the beach by the water Jessie loved. Everyone prayed for her to be found and for justice for her suffering. Their prayers were answered on May 19th when Jessica Bardwell was found deceased. Her loved ones at least had the chance to mourn her and say goodbye. Gary felt it necessary to review his daughter's autopsy report. He was appalled that his girl, wrapped in a sheet and barely recognizable as a human, was discarded like trash. Her body was returned to her hometown thanks to Gary's friends. Former colleagues hired and loaded Jessie into a funeral hearse. About 1,000 people visited the First United Methodist Church to pay their respects to the victim. Kitty Bardwell, Jessie's grandmother, confessed, "If this town could be cleansed with the tears shed for Jessie, it would truly be clean." The tragedy that struck their family garnered widespread attention, with many expressing sincere condolences for their premature loss, coming forward to support the Bardwells. A year had passed. Gary sat in McKinney Jail in Texas, still reluctantly cooperating with the investigation. However, 2 facts regarding Jessie's case were eventually extracted from him. Firstly, he claimed what happened to her was an accident, planning to reveal the details in court, hoping for the jury's understanding. This made it challenging for the prosecution to build their case during the trial, much to the delight of Andy Farkas, Lowe's attorney. Farkas staged a mock trial with outsiders acting as jurors. Based on the available evidence and Jason's confession, the mock trial regarding Jessica's case fell apart. 15 pseudo-jurors decided to acquit Lowe. Farkas hoped that knowing the truth, a real court would also deliver a not guilty verdict. Remember the anonymous tip about the victim's body location? It turned out that information came from Jason himself. This became another piece of evidence obtained during the investigation. The prosecution offered a deal to reduce his sentence by half if he disclosed Jessie's location. After deliberation and consultation with his lawyer, he agreed, requesting that the source of the information remain confidential until the trial. The deal was motivated by law enforcement's desire to allow Jessie's family to say goodbye and bury her body humanely. As time went on, the grief-stricken father longed for justice. To quell his raging fury, he once decided to take a unique approach. Gary printed a photo of Jason, placed it on a stump, and pounded it with a 12-pound sledgehammer. This form of psychological therapy offered him some, albeit small, relief. Mr. Bardwell confessed to struggling to get out of bed in the mornings, living with the hope that Lowe would soon face trial and be convicted for the murder of his only daughter. He blamed himself for what happened, regretting not convincing his daughter to stay, or at least break up with her controlling boyfriend. Jessie once called her father, admitting he was right after arguing with Jason, who had kicked her out. She was sheltered by a new friend, but returned to her boyfriend the next day, giving him another chance. Gary had no choice but to accept his daughter's decision, a choice he would deeply regret later. When the trial finally began, Mr. Bardwell arrived in Texas, determined to achieve just punishment. Prosecutor Cynthia Walker began her opening statement by characterizing Jason. Most viewed him as a complex personality with few friends, mostly avoided due to his long history with controlled substances, often leading to uncontrollable rage. Perhaps Jesse was caught in one of these moments. Prosecutor Wes Wynn called Lowe's former girlfriends as witnesses. They confirmed the prosecution's claims about his aggression, sharing fears for their lives due to his jealousy-driven violence. Like with Jesse, he isolated them from family and friends, displaying clear manipulative and pathological lying traits. Hence, each ended their relationship, which was no easy feat, requiring caution and cunning. Conversely, Lowe showcased his superiority among men, effectively pulling the wool over people's eyes. Jason quickly responded to these court revelations. He disclosed starting substance use at 13, influenced by friends, leading to addiction. Nevertheless, he strived to not lose his way in life, achieving multiple degrees and working for a renowned global company. Lowe confessed his desire to fulfill Jesse's dream out of love, aiming to build a family with her. In contrast, the prosecution painted a picture of a man far from someone who had recently lost his beloved, and here's why. The investigation determined that the young woman's demise occurred between May 1st and May 3rd, presumably on the day when the Jordans, the couple's neighbors, last saw her alive. Following an argument that led to Jesse's demise, Jason moved her body to the garage and placed it in the trunk of his car, where it remained for several days. The blood traces found in the Audi indeed belonged to Jesse. He later transported her body to a remote farm and concealed it in the nearby woods. It was established that the sheet wrapping the body was part of Lowe's bedding set, which was still found in his home. Fearlessly using it even after Jesse's death, while her body was decomposing in the car, the accused continued to see other women. His phone was filled with corroborative messages and intimate photos, which he sent to these women before meeting them at his apartment. Jason explained that he was trying to distract himself and forget, often indulging in substance use, claiming it made dealing with reality easier. The investigation learned of Jason's presence at Jesse's time of death through a clever manipulation. As the suspect had long denied involvement, detectives asked Tommy Jordan, an acquaintance, to speak with Jason. During their monitored conversation, Lowe admitted he messed up and made a mistake, confessing to an unfortunate accident with Jesse and his guilt, albeit for criminal negligence. Law enforcement took this as a confession. Realizing the investigation was on to him, Jason struck a deal with the prosecution and disclosed the body's location. At the trial, he finally shared his version of events. That evening, he and Jesse took pills that enhanced libido and then became intimate in the shower. At one point, Jason slipped, followed by Jesse, who hit her head on the porcelain bathtub. She then sat down, complaining of feeling hot and dizzy. Jason claimed he offered to call an ambulance, but Jesse refused, suggesting rest and sleep would suffice. However, he found her unconscious the next morning, lying on his chest without breathing. Despite his attempts to revive her, Jesse was dead. Fearing being accused of homicide, he hesitated to call the police and decided to act on his own, initially leaving the body in his car. Days later, he resolved to hide the body on a remote farm, where he carelessly disposed of his former lover in a pile of trash without a proper burial. His story might have been believable if not for the defendant's character and the forensic medical examination findings. The woman had suffered cranial injuries, which couldn't have resulted from slaps to the face, indicating Jason attempted to conceal evidence of a beating. Thus, his entire narrative was fabricated. After a 6-hour deliberation, the jury found him guilty. Judge Scott Becker sentenced the criminal to 50 years in prison. The term could have been longer, up to 99 years, but was reduced due to Jason's deal with the prosecution as agreed. Lowe won't be eligible for parole until at least 2041. At the verdict announcement, Gary was relieved justice prevailed, yet he saw no remorse in the young man's eyes. Standing with the victim's father were Jason's ex-girlfriends. One, Chrissy Chambers, remarked that if she could say anything to Jesse, it would be, "Run. Just save yourself." To this day, the convicted Loeb denies his guilt in the homicide, insisting it was an accident. The love of his life decayed in his car while he continued to live and entertain himself. Tragically, Jesse Bardwell saw the dark side of Jason Lowe too late. Daddy's girl hadn't realized how deceitful and brutal men could be, having always had a model of male integrity and care in her father Gary. Regrettably, scoundrels possess a peculiar charm, easily lying or embellishing to intrigue or enamor. This story is a cautionary tale that a woman must choose herself, her safety, and her freedom always and regardless. Otherwise, the story's end can be tragic not just for her but for her entire family.